All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are here for our first afternoon panel. And yesterday afternoon, we had a total solar eclipse. Today, we have a panel on acquisition and tech transfer. Just as exciting, trust me. All right, in all seriousness, you heard General Hawk talk about the importance of acquisition authorities and the importance of partnering with private industry and other partners to develop capabilities. And so that's really on the leading, cutting edge and right on the tip of the tongue of Cyber Command and the national security ecosystem. And so I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Eric Rosenberg, who was introduced previously as a moderator. But just as a reminder, he is one of our superstar civilian attorneys at the U.S. Cyber Command Legal Office, practicing contract, fiscal, acquisition, and tech transfer. Eric, over to you.
Thanks, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson. So we're going to introduce our panelists. So we got Mark Montgomery. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Pleasure to have you here. We have Courtney Maggiulli. She is the procurement executive, program executive officer cyber at U.S. Cyber Command, part of our J9. And we also have Aaron Smith. He is the CISO of Doyon Utilities up in Alaska. So we really appreciate you coming down all the way from there just to speak with us. So the topic of our panel today is innovation in government acquisition and technology transfer. So to kind of before we got into that, we're going to talk a bit about fiscal law, right? So it's kind of unique to the government. For those of you who aren't government attorneys, fiscal law kind of governs the spending of money in the government, because Congress goes back to the Constitution and power of the purse. Like Congress gives us a certain amount of money, and they want it to be spent in on certain types of things in a certain time period and up to a certain amount. And they don't want us to exceed the amount which they give us. There's a certain level of activity that Congress wants us to be doing, and not above that. And so that's sort of a key thing. So when so they give us this money, and they want us to do a certain level of activity. So whenever we get stuff, we need to generally pay for it unless there's a statute that says otherwise. And so through acquisition and technology transfer, these are ways that sometimes we then get things. And so with acquisition, typically through procurement contracts, we usually spend money to get things. So the definition of procurement contract is when the principal purpose of the instrument is to acquire goods or services for the direct benefit or use of the government. And that can be by barter, purchase, or lease. Technology transfer, the definition of that is different. So technology transfer is basically just the exchange of resources between the DoD and a non-DoD entity. That's the definition you'll find in the DoD 5535.08 on technology transfer. And so it's a bit different. And specifically within technology transfer, we have these agreements called CRADAs. So those are cooperative research and development agreements. And so there's this relationship between acquisition and technology transfer. So acquisition, most procurement contracts are governed by what's called the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. And the FAR, most contracts fall under it, and kind of lays out all these rules, procedures for how the government should go about getting goods and services from the private sector. There's also non-FAR agreements that are part of procurement as well. You have other transaction agreements. A whole host of other ways. If you go on the Defense Acquisition University website, there's a beautiful contracting cone. At least I find it beautiful. Maybe for people who are more normal, you don't find it beautiful. But it's a beautiful cone, and it lays out all these different ways of working with the private sector through different acquisition vehicles. Now, but with tech transfer, we have CRADAs, and basically the definition of a CRADA is when we take resources, people, equipment, facilities, other resources. We pool that with a private sector entity or a non-federal entity, and then together we collaboratively research and develop consistent with the laboratory's mission, except it can't be a procurement contract. So a procurement contract and a CRADA, they can't be the same thing by definition. Court case on this called Chemical Services versus EPA. We won't get into the details of it too much, but the idea generally is that CRADAs are contracts, but they're not FAR contracts. And it's a key thing. So with CRADA, the key thing is the principal purpose has to be R&D, whereas procurement contracts, the principal purpose is to acquire goods and services. So with CRADAs, we can get to we can leverage the resources of the private sector, their people and their equipment, but it's not the principal purpose of it. So how do you get to use CRADAs and patent license agreements and software license agreements, these various technology transfer authorities that exist? You have to be a federal laboratory. And to be a federal laboratory, that's a facility for which the substantial purpose is the performance of research, development, or engineering by the federal government's employees. So there's sort of this substantial purpose test. So there was a debate about, well, what is the limit of what is a federal laboratory? So there was a court case called Babbitt, and in Babbitt, Yellowstone National Park, they entered into a CRADA with a company, and someone didn't like that idea. They're like, no, Yellowstone National Park, that's like for tourism, right? Like, they're not a lab. And that's not what I don't really think of a lab when I think of Yellowstone National Park. But, the court said it doesn't conjure up the traditional image of a laboratory, but there is actual R&D occurring at Yellowstone National Park. Now, it's not the principal purpose of Yellowstone, but it is a substantial purpose. It meets that test. And so the idea is that, if Yellowstone National Park's a lab, then Cybercom could be a lab too. And so on October 18th, 2023, General Nakasone designated Cybercom as a laboratory for technology transfer purposes. So that's sort of the touchstone of why we're now engaging in technology transfer agreements, is because we are a federal laboratory. And so that's sort of our intro. Now we'll move to Courtney. We want to kind of sort of go over sort of how acquisition works at Cybercom. So I guess how does it work? Where do our authorities come from? How do we do what we do?
Good afternoon. Is this on? We good? So Cybercom is a combatant command, and combatant commands are operational commands. They don't traditionally do acquisition. The one exception to that before Cybercom was SOCOM. And so SOCOM was a little bit different. They were designated a major force program, which made them service-like without creating a brand new service. And they grew really big, really fast, and Congress went, whoa, that was a lot. So Cybercom was constructed a little bit differently. In FY16, the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, gave Cybercom limited acquisition authority. We could spend up to $75 million. We were given 10 billets to go and start trying to do acquisition successfully. We got one program manager, 2 contracting officers, SJA, legal support. And we were told, all right, go try this out, but this is going to sunset in a couple years. This is not forever. We want to see if you can even do this. And the command was successful. And so over a series of subsequent NDAAs, all of those restrictions were lifted. So today there is no ceiling on our acquisition authorities at Cybercom. And we've been growing. So that initial 75 million limitation, now that we are unrestricted in FY23, we did about 750 million. And we're continuing to grow. I think you heard earlier about enhanced budgetary control, which gives the command the decision authority over affordability decisions for cyber across the services and the cyber service components. So we're expanding our ability to acquire cyber goods, cyber services for the DoD in an integrated and holistic way. In FY24, I touched on we had those 10 billets initially. We're adding 50 billets this year. So we are staffing up for a right-sized and ready workforce. And it's a pretty exciting place to be. Eric touched on our lab designation. So we are growing into these authorities and starting to execute in more and more rapid and responsive ways.
Exactly, Courtney. And could you go a bit into the Joint Cyber Warfighting Architecture, known as the JICWA?
Can, Eric. So the FY22 NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, tasked us, and we were told to go stand up a new program executive office for the Joint Cyber Warfighting Architecture. What does that mean? The purpose of JICWA is to integrate cyber capability development priorities across the services. So there are service cyber components today, and they run their own programs, but we're not integrated and optimized. So that's really the primary purpose. DoD has 133 cyber mission teams. So this architecture is necessary for integrating the priorities that then deliver for those teams to go execute missions with. JICWA is centered on innovation and modernizing technology in the cyber domain. And the cyber domain is really dynamic. So that integration is crucial because things are changing every day and we have to be unified. We bring together the best in breed of all of the different tool capabilities. And most importantly, it's the talent of the people across the services as well. It's inclusive of 5 parts. We have a comprehensive suite of cyber tools, a unified platform for integrating and analyzing data, joint command and control mechanisms, sensors in support of the defense of our networks, and the persistent cyber training environment, which provides training and for mission rehearsal.
Great. So I think let's move on to Mark. So how do you view the current state of DoD acquisition, and how can it be improved?
Well, that's a pretty open-ended question. I'll just start by saying generally broken. And I'm not talking about in cyber here, I mean in general. I mean, the Navy just published a list that basically every ship we're building took a 1 to 4 year slip, and it's taken 10 to 100% increases. I could go through the Air Force and the Army and do the same thing. So we have a broken acquisition system. I think Secretary Hicks or Deputy Secretary Hicks has made that clear as well. Interestingly, in cyber, it's different. I'll talk about that in a second. But I do want to just stick on the fact that it's broken, and we'll talk a little bit later on about ways to get at it. I hope in a question. But I'll start with that. I'll say I loved your description. I was part of the congressional staff that wrote most of those incremental things, or when we were in the Solarium Commission did the same. But I'll tell you, we did the wrong thing for the right reason, right? The services are broken in their ability to generate forces. And that's not, recently at FDD, we've done a paper on the personnel part. You can certainly look it up, fdd.org. There's a pretty good paper there on why we need a cyber force. But we really didn't spend as much time as we should have on the acquisition part, which is that the reason we had to do this, and it is, as you pointed out, unusual. And the last time we did it, it was a dumpster fire. I mean, we should tell the truth about SOCOM. In the end, we ended up with $2 billion submarine submersibles in an Idaho lake of no value to the government. So when we leave a COCOM in charge of acquisition, we take risk. That doesn't mean it's not going to do great at Cyber Command. I'm just telling you, we're 1 for 1 on, took a lot of risk. And the lack of, I think you described it perfectly, the reason we need JICWA is because the forces were not aligned or integrated or developing forces. How can Cyber Command win when you have four services who aren't fully committed to providing the equipment and the people to generate the force structure you need? This isn't a jam on Cyber Command. Cyber Command gets a lot done with the stuff it's given. Not enough, but a lot. So in my mind, that's part of that brokenness. And I have to be clear here, we're also taking an incredible risk. And we did it knowingly, like Representative Langevin was the #1 driver of all this. But we'd sit there and wonder who is going to be the civilian oversight. Like when a service does something, builds something, they have civilian oversight. That civilian oversight doesn't exist in Cyber Command, in a combatant command, in the same way it exists in a service. So we're taking, and Congress doesn't do good oversight for a lot of reasons, but we have lost our, we are now taking risk by having a combatant command. We have no other choice. We're going to keep doing it because we're at that. But so when you ask me how we are, we're broken. We're recovering with an incredibly risky plan that's already 0 for 1 in execution back in the 2000s. So I worry. And I'll never say the words, I'll never say, by the way, I find DFARS beautiful. I appreciate that you said that. And I'll never begin any sentence with, there's a recent court case. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and learn from you guys at this. But I'm going to start off by saying I think we're in a risky place. I think we got ourselves here on our own. I think our services have done no good to help Cyber Command on this. And I really hope you're successful in digging us out of this hole.
Thank you, Mark. Courtney, so how has Cybercom been innovative in its acquisitions?
Follow. So to do a slight reattack and then build off with the question, I think the command is a really exciting place to be. I started out by talking about how we were given very limited acquisition authority, and I hope that telling you that 10 billets, and by the way, they were not all resourced from the start, to where we are today helps amplify the growth that has started to occur. So we started very small. We didn't start to implement until FY17, and we've grown to today. And I think this is very exciting because we've done small-scale innovation, and we're now poised to grow. And that growth and innovation at the command, I hope, will address some of the concerns that you've touched upon. So I'm going to stick a little bit to my script to make sure that everything I say is appropriate for public release. But if you Google DIU, which is the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU Cyber Command Hunt Kits, you'll find their product catalog. And this addresses a really great partnership that we constructed with the DIU organization, FY22. We took these kits that we had that were already in existence, but they weren't meeting mission need. They were developed for use in government networks with security parameters, and they were not forward deployable for the missions that our teams needed to go execute. And so through DIU, they're a phenomenal organization that helped us do prototyping. This is fast, so if you're not familiar with prototyping, it allows the government to say, listen, we know what our problems are, and we don't know the granular decomposed requirements that normally we would spend a very long time defining, and we don't have that time. We want to allowably produce something that has mission effectiveness, that is of high value and not sitting at the bottom of a lake in Idaho. And we partnered with them, and we were able to generate successful, rapidly prototyped kits, combination of hardware and software, travel-friendly for operations at mission partner sites that had demonstrated measurable effectiveness that was superior to the traditional tools and applications available at their sites. So this is a great success story. We've been smaller because the command has had a small posture. That posture is growing. In fact, I believe we're about to be hiring for another agreements officer. Tell your friends. But we are committed through what our lab is doing and through our teams of professionals and then through our partnerships with folks like DIU to growing that innovation at the command.
Yeah, and just to kind of touch back on the different types of vehicles, so those were achieved through what are known as other transaction agreement, prototype other transaction agreement, prototype OTAs, and then we've done a follow-on production OTA. So that's the contractual vehicle we're using to acquire those hunt forward kits. So Courtney, what makes cyber acquisition unique compared to, like, let's say buying a tank or a submarine? What makes it different?
So the cyber domain is different. It's fast, it's rapid. So we don't have the ability to take the time that you would normally put in to building a tank or a fighter jet or putting up a satellite is 10 years. We don't have 10 years to wait. We can't afford, you touched on a 4 or 5 year slip. In 4 to 5 years, anything we're talking about today is going to be obsolete. So that introduces challenges, right? How do we allowably stand up programs that are responsive, but still have some level of oversight and some level of guardrails? And so striking that balance with the right risk acceptance is really crucial. We are doing some exciting things to get after those challenges. So one challenge in DoD, we have what we call the colors of money, which means that money is not just money. I can't just take money I've been allocated and go spend it on the things that I need. I have procurement dollars for procuring things. I have research and development dollars. I have operations and maintenance dollars, and you have to use the right dollars for the right thing, because when you mess that up, you have to stop spending that money and go back and fix your actions. So we received in an FY19 NDAA and then an FY20 NDAA with additional detail a little really cool pilot to try spending money like it's money, so that when we field a piece of software, okay, should that be O&M? Well, we're going to go back and modernize it. We're going to do some enhancements to it. Ooh, is that RDT&E? I don't know. Okay, let's remove that restriction. This is really fun because it's also aligned to the programming, planning, budgeting, and execution report that came out on modernization and enhancements there. So the command is really at the forefront of looking at how do we need to spend money in a way that supports the forces. Another challenge that we have is constructing acquisition strategies that are responsive. So major capability acquisition, that's where we think about traditional acquisition, milestone A, milestone B, very labor intensive, very time intensive, very rigorous. And DoD has given us some really great tools in the adaptive acquisition framework. Software acquisition pathway and middle tier of acquisition with rapid prototyping are allowable ways to pursue acquisition that have strategies that are more responsive and tailored to the types of acquisitions we're doing. And so we're being given flexibilities and tools by Congress that allow us to be faster and more responsive for the type of acquisition we're doing with cyber. Let's see. And then you touched on the FAR, and I appreciate your enthusiasm as well. I am enthusiastic about acquisition because it allows us to get after needs that we have. But a singular system is really difficult to align to acquisitions which are not a singular type of acquisition. And with cyber being rapid and needing responsive software and services in a little bit of a different way, we now have access to systems through some of what you touched on, right? Non-FAR-based contracts that allow us to be more responsive as well. So it's a little bit different, and we have some challenges, and then we have some solutions that we're starting to pursue that are pretty exciting for us.
But on one thing on that, I agree completely with Courtney. By the way, I love your idea that it's an exciting place at Cyber Command acquisition. I believe it probably should be. Risky places are exciting. That's where I would want to go. But on the issue of what's unique here in defense cyber acquisition is that, let's say I was going to build a tank. It isn't like, hey, Southern Company wants to build a tank as well, or PG&E is building a tank. We're just doing it on our own, and we can fiddle-faddle around, and that's how we end up at 3 to 5 years. What's really unique in cyber acquisition, particularly in defensive tools, but even to some degree some of the offensive tools, is somebody else is also, there's a whole marketplace out there in the private sector, and that's a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is, if I were given advice if somebody came to me and said, man, Mark, I broke the code, I have the best tool for anomalous activity detection in the world, my first piece of advice would be, do not go anywhere near DoD or the IC. Run to the private sector and sell your product and make a ton of money. Because if you run to DoD and IC, I won't see you again for 12 to 18 months, and that's being generous. And whereas, we don't want that to be the theory. We want DoD and the IC to be seen as the first choice, not I need to go there. And so I think in cyber, if we want to be on the cutting edge of innovation, if we want entrepreneurs who are out there developing tools to come to the department and come to the intelligence community, then we're going to have to create an environment where they can move at the same speed and pace they can in the private sector. And I know your goal is to get there, but I would just say, in general, the Department of Defense has not been the place you go for agility.
Thank you, Mark. I think we're trying to get that leveraging these different types of tools. That's also where the creative discussion will come in, right? Because sometimes we buy things that they ultimately don't work, but creatives are a way we can kind of explore the realm of the possible for offensive and defensive cyber capabilities. Kind of pre-acquisition and kind of learn what types of capabilities would work for us and what wouldn't. And so I think together I think we can we're going to have more sort of comprehensive planning, like using CRADAs, using OTAs, using CIBRs, to try to kind of get at these problems kind of left of big A acquisition, and that way we can kind of reduce costs. And this actually ties into the next question, which I know you're looking forward to, sir, is about the Valley of Death. So could you kind of explain the Valley of Death concept, and how do we get out of it?
So the Valley of Death, and I think everyone in here probably gets it, but the shorthand is the amount of time from when we introduce a product into that R&D phase and end up with a product that's at least in the operational test and evaluation and potentially ready to go into low rate initial production. And if you look at a Navy ship, that's a 10 to 15 year process. Aircraft are about the same. I think smaller items, handheld items can be 3 to 5 years. But in cyber, as Courtney's alluded to, we're getting special authorities and we're doing things to try to shorten that process. Part of giving SOCOM acquisition authority was the secretary, I think it was, might even go all the way back to Rumsfeld, I think, who just became extremely frustrated with the answers he got from service acquisition authorities on the new weapons that we were discovering we needed in 2002, 2003, 2004 as we started to enter, significant ground combat. So that valley of death is an excessively long time through which the seed funding or initial funding for a company expires before they can get through that R&D or and into operational test and evaluation. I think this leads at a bigger problem for the department, which is that we don't take risk right. And I think Deputy Secretary Hicks has talked about this a couple times. Probably, the kind of early release of the replicator was a reflection of her frustration with the department's inability to take risk in acquisition. What I mean by that is that we have a success rate in the department, and I say this kind of humorously, of 99% on our programs, because we just keep throwing money and time at the programs, and eventually they're a success. Now, not in a way that you and I would define success if we ran our personal checkbook, and we're 10 years behind on the rent, and and the house is half the size we expected. We would be really unhappy. But the problem we have is we're not willing to take risk. What I would love to see is that if of 100 products that Cyber Command put into the gonculator to start looking at the R&D level, if 40 to 50% failed. In other words, have a high failure rate. But right now, I've worked my way up through the ranks in the Navy. Most of the people in here are working their way up through the civilian or officer enlisted ranks in the services. You don't get promoted by failure, right? There's a sense of zero defect. It really permeates the procurement
But Mark,
program.
I guess, what do you think of SBIRs, though, and SITRs? Like, that's small business innovation research. Yeah. That's when the government does make different size bets. Phase 1 SBIR, that's a bunch of little bets, and then phase 2's slightly, a fewer number of bigger bets, and TACFI and STRATFI. What's your sort of take on that?
I'm a big fan, and I'll go further and say that I think the Office of Strategic Capital is onto something with their bets on small business loans. I'll also tell you that the small business loans, the DoD is like a infinitesimal percentage of the federal government's. So just to be clear, the DoD isn't near as excited about SBIRs as we in this room might be, right? Big DoD. They don't bet. If you go to most PEOs and say, hey, I got an idea here, about 70% chance it'll work, but it's going to take about $40 million for me to figure out if that's true or not. You're out of the room. Next guy's in who goes, it's 100% chance I'm going to succeed, or it's 98 or 99. We want that success rate. Look at our number of non-McCurdy breaches. It's like 2 or 3. But you look at the number of programs that are donkeys out there that have gone way over budget, but we rename them or restart them or do something. We all know the bull hockey that the department produces to get its way through these fence posts and milestones. And so, from my perspective, we need to experience a lot more failure, real failure at the front end, so that we can get to this. And that's where innovation kicks in. If you want to have innovation, you got to have failure. If you go to a venture capital firm and you ask them what's their failure rate, they're going to say 70%, right? That 70% of the people they put a little money into fail, or come back at 1x or 2x, right? Not a failure in terms of making money.
Thank you, Mark. Courtney, do you want to add anything?
So I'm a huge champion of empowering our workforce. That's one of my biggest cornerstones. When you touch on failure, I actually really embrace that. That's kind of a key principle of prototyping, right? Which is one of the new acquisition pathways I touched on. You don't prototype to go straight into production. You're prototyping to fail fast and cheaply, so that when you get to your end thing, you've already gotten the failure out of the way, and you're not investing heavy program dollars at that juncture. So how do we do that? How do we create that culture? It's through investments in the workforce. And I'm thrilled with some of the training that is starting to evolve and come out of DAU. There's a credential for other transactions, and there's a lot of classes that are getting us towards things like CRADAs. I'm a huge fan of CRADAs. You touched on things sitting on the shelf. What we need is not COTS anymore, not commercial on the shelf, because we, again, don't have time. Things are antiquated too fast in the cyber environment. We need CRADAs, not for commercial on the shelf, but to go straight to commercialized innovation that's out there and bringing it in. And again, the way that we do that is through the empowerment of the workforce. And so that is a huge focus in the cyber area, because it's not a stodgy and antiquated and outdated acquisition model that we want people to come in with. We really want to leverage these tools that we've been given with a workforce that knows how to use them strategically and effectively.
I just wish a senior leader, I love what you say, but I wish a senior leader would just stand up and say, you know, I'm a big fan of failure. Because I would believe if someone said that, we would be actually on the track to success. But I think there's a disconnect at the very senior level between their understanding of failure rates and prototyping things, and probably, you know, at the program executive officer level. I do think there's still that disconnect, and I don't think a PEO can have like 2 or 3 failures in a row and move on to program number 4.
Thank you, Mark. So we're going to pivot a bit now back to tech transfer for a little bit. So before I came to Cybercom, I was actually at the 67th Cyberspace Wing. I was their chief of cyber IP law, and I had the pleasure of negotiating with Aaron Smith on what was our second critical infrastructure CRADA. And so what does that mean? So there's different things we do with CRADAs. There's really kind of infinite possibilities. But you know, the type that Cybercom is going to be focusing on is one bucket, like capability development focused CRADAs. Like we just signed a CRADA with University of Missouri, Kansas City. It's going to focus on UAV-enabled cyber ops and AI-enabled cyber ops, and you know, really exploring the realm of the possible for offensive cyber. And it's going to be a great opportunity to partner with academia. The other type of CRADAs we're going to be doing are what we call critical infrastructure CRADAs. That's where we research and develop collaboratively with the partner, you know, potentially on their networks, to develop, you know, new TTPs for defending different types of systems. We're talking often operational technology, industrial control systems. This is really beneficial to our forces because they often, you know, do not have as much experience with OTICS systems. But if this country were to be attacked, OTICS networks, you know, for the power plant, the water company, these would be, you know, of interest to the adversary. And so it's really important that we get our folks sort of that experience and the relationships with the private sector so we can have this true public-private convergence. So if there was an attack, we could really hit the ground running. We already know that power plant near the military base. We already have a CRADA with them, and you know, we can save hours, and that could really save lives. The first critical infrastructure CRADA we did at the wing was with CPS Energy in San Antonio, but the second one we did was with Doyon Utilities. So Aaron, could you kind of describe a bit, you know, why you entered into a CRADA with the government and how that came about?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Eric, for letting me come up here, or over here, really. A couple days ago, I was fishing on the Naknek, which if you ever get a chance to go to Alaska and fish, you should absolutely do it. And it took me 24 hours to get to D.C., but it's well worth it. So I just want to say, 1, thank you. And 2, and 2, really, thanks to everybody in this room. You know, I'm maybe not as lively as the discussion that's happening over here, but it's after lunch. But just everybody in this room really helps support what we do. If we didn't have the government side, the FBI partnerships, the DOE partnerships that I have, I would be losing this fight, right? As a chief information officer of a utility company with some real adversaries that are coming to shut us down, because if you can shut us down, you can shut some of the capabilities completely off in Alaska. So, you know, if it's 40 below and you can turn my power plant off or my heat plant off from a, you know, threat actor's perspective, you can significantly limit what the DoD is able to put into the fight or the potential fight. So Doyon Utilities is a utility company that was really created just to run the Army's utilities in Alaska. And everybody here sees Alaska on a map. I'm sure everybody in this room knows exactly how big Alaska is. But from the 3 main installations, the utilities are vastly different, right? Heat is a very big issue on one side of the plant. Again, if it shuts down, that base starts to freeze out at a certain period of time. And then in other areas, we got to keep the power up for obvious reasons down south in J-Bear, and the water plant's got to keep going, or again, you start to, you know, really hold back what you're able to deploy as a force and a combatant commander. And I'm sure, again, you guys understand that piece, so I don't have to go through all that. And I will say that I don't use many acronyms as everybody else in this panel or everybody else I've heard talk, so I'll just throw that out there. I get lost a little bit, even though I'm actually a DoD person myself. Sometimes some of these, especially lawyers, love acronyms more than anybody else, I think. So Anyway, that's what Doyon Utilities is. We're the Army's utilities. We don't have the opportunity to fail. We have to provide safe, reliable utilities to those installations so that we can, really provide that critical infrastructure space. So Eric, I may be jumping a little bit, but he came to our lawyer and said, hey, we want to get into this cooperative research and development agreement. And the lawyer, very on top of it, says, I don't really know what you're asking of me, but I've got somebody who does. And I saw this agreement and was very excited with one exception. I told Eric when I started talking, I said, if this is just a tabletop exercise where you want to come in and sit around a table like this, no offense, and talk about cyber and cyber defense, I don't want anything. You're wasting my time. That would be an absolute waste of what we have, the resources that we bring to bear on the civilian side and the resources that I know are out there on, really at this point in time, the Air Force side from a cyber protection team. So it was really good conversation. It was a really innovative conversation. Again, partnerships and information sharing is a huge pillar of the strategy when I came in that we set was if we don't have good information sharing, if we don't have good partners across the entire threat space to include really now what we're doing here, then we're going to lose this fight from my perspective. And the civilian side is absolutely going to lose that fight without those type of partnerships. So I recently got to spend a week with the FBI, really at their CISO Academy. I'm now here. So these partnerships are I just can't foot stomp enough that how critical they are and how really welcome they are. And hopefully they're beneficial both ways. And I really think they are.
Oh, absolutely, Aaron. I think Secretors, they're an imperfect tool, but they're really our best tool for public-private convergence. I just really want to emphasize this. It's not one attorney at Cybercom, when I was introducing the concept, he was like, are creators a panacea for all of our problems? I'm like, well, no, but it is one of our best tools for this sort of collaborative, working with the private sector on these problems. And so, Aaron, what sorts of activities have we done with, has the wing done with Doyon Utilities via the CREA?
Yeah. So the 67th sent us over to Scott. We got the 853rd. The Roosters came up for us, and fantastic group. They have been back to Doyon Utilities 3 different times. We've looked at 3 different sets of utilities. We're able to actually provide them with live data, so we were able to get them effectively into our network without actually being into our network. We can't cross that barrier and disrupt, obviously, those operational pieces. So we talk operational technology. We're making water, we're making power, we're producing heat. The very first exercise actually convinced them to come up when it was quite cold outside. I think it was a shock to most of that team, but it was a good shock. Very professional, but the first one was really just to look at one of our water plants. Just really, we're going to provide them again with what's happening in our operational technology, which looks an awful lot like an IT system with a little bit of variances here and there. But give them a good look at what a commercial water plant looks like. So, this team had been used to looking at DOD installations, really Air Force water plants. So it was a different look for them to come in and look at what our water plant looked like. The type of traffic we were producing was relatively similar, but the way we were doing what we were doing across the space was definitely different to them, right? So we have, it was a different look. I don't have a bunch of airmen that are in there running this, or a contractor from perspective that are working with airmen. It was really, this is a privatized utility that was running things, and I'd like to say much like a good, strong privatized utility should. And then we progressed from there. So we expanded, and they were able to bring some very young team members out to see this space, as well as bring back some of their seasoned teams. Everybody in this room knows that a good cyber defender gets sucked up by the private sector almost as fast as they can get them. So some of that rotating piece was really, I think, helpful for that team. And it was helpful for us to get the look from the Air Force's side, what they had seen around the space and the pieces of that they were working on, just from the cyber defense side. We'll get into some challenges too, and I would say that one of the big challenges we've had and continue to struggle with, and hopefully Eric can help us sort some of these out kind of going forward, is it's very difficult for us to share information back and forth at times. We found Doyon Utilities is partially owned by a Canadian company. That created a significant roadblock. It's some challenges with our DoD partnerships. So we sort of struggle with this information back and forth, but just having them in 3 different years in a row, come back repetitively, work through them throughout the year. We've been out to visit their site at Scott. It's just been a super valuable partnership to us. I can go back to my shareholders and say, look at the support we're getting. Go back to the Army and say, look at the support we're getting from the DoD as a whole. We've got Air Force cyber teams inside a privatized utility that's directly supplying to our one customer, which is the Army. And that's a pretty powerful message, I think, across the space. It's been very successful.
And thank you for that. And look how you teed up a legal issue for me to discuss, so people can know how to partner with the government. So yeah, so with CRADAs, so by default, when we have a CRADA with a company, we can share up to controlled unclassified information, CUI, with them, assuming they have the appropriate systems to take on that CUI. But then we can also do classified work under CRADAs. So the CRADA's joint work plan can sometimes require classified work, and if that's true, the company can use this as a justification to get a security clearance. We don't pay for it; they would have to pay for it, but they can use this as the justification. And at the, when I was at the wing, there were several companies that were able to get security clearances because they had CRADAs with us. So that's a way we can sort of expand the DIB. So getting at what makes cyber acquisition hard, the DIB for cyber is quite small because there are often a lot of security clearance barriers, right, that make it harder for companies that are just starting out to get involved. So CRADAs are a way we can expand the DIB. Now we don't enter into CRADAs to get company security clearances. That's not why we would do it. But it is an incidental benefit of companies entering into CRADAs with Cyber Command, with the Wing, with other entities, with AFRL and places like that. Now, touching on the foreign ownership aspect. So yeah, there's 3 buckets of CRADAs. There's just pure domestic CRADAs. Then there's foreign-owned U.S. subsidiaries, and then there's non-domestic CRADAs. Purely, they're in Japan or, South Korea. And so with a domestic CRADA, the idea of the technology transfer statutes and, the CRADA statute is, we can just pick any company we want to work with and we can just work with them, which is why it's very different from the FAR, where there's much more sort of procedures on who you can work with. Now, with a foreign-owned U.S. subsidiary, we have to go to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to get their sort of concurrence. They're kind of looking at factors like, does the home country, not, because it's a U.S. company, but it's foreign-owned, and does that foreign company that owns it, does that host government, does the home government treat U.S. IP rights with respect? Do they enter into similar agreements with our companies? And sort of there's a reciprocity sort of notion. And then when we do a pure non-domestic CRADA, then each DoD component for tech transfer has to kind of build out their procedures for doing pure non-domestic CRADAs. One is to go out to the Office of U.S. Trade Representative. But then you're probably going to want to do a more holistic approach. In Cybercom, we have a DoD technology transfer instruction that we published in September. And it kind of lays out our procedures, and we kind of put our J5 kind of out in front on trying to do that coordination with the whole of U.S. government on how to kind of go out and do non-domestic CRADAs. So that just highlights a few issues. But yeah, so obviously his company, partially foreign-owned, so then that did kind of inhibit some information sharing. We do hope, though, with companies that, I think so it's a stumbling block, but, overall, though, we think CRADAs are a way to do information sharing, to do kind of blue-red teaming exercises, to do, to do kind of, help do what we call technology tradecraft transfer, where we're transferring our skill sets in hunt, assess, and hardening to the partner, so that way they can help themselves. So also, Aaron, I think you touched upon this a bit, but I guess why do you think it's beneficial for the cyber mission force to be able to experience private networks?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about partnerships. It's a theme across the space. I think that just really what brings some good health on both sides is this relationship piece that we're building across the space. So again, I think it's key for us to build a relationship and understand that we're protecting DoD assets, and that we're helping support that mission, and that those DoD assets are in turn really providing us with some insight to maybe better keep our utilities running and making sure that critical infrastructure piece is running. Again, there are lots of different partnerships that we have, right? The FBI is obviously a key critical partner for us. Department of Energy is very helpful, and the Department of Energy is actually going to get over some of these hurdles of foreign-owned companies as well. So I think this information sharing is key. I think addressing and hitting these issues head on and making sure we can get that data across has been very helpful. And I think even just the declassification that was talked about earlier and getting that out to where we can act on some of these really classified pieces all kind of play into this idea that we have a cooperative research and development agreement. We're helping build cyber defenders out there in the real world, as well as protecting assets that are right there on the front lines in a space that is very critical to our actions moving forward in the future to make sure that we're a good deterring force and, if necessary, a good engaged force.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aaron. So I guess we'd like to open up to questions if we have time. We got time for one question.
I'm curious if that CREA program actually creates market challenges with some of the national labs, because it would seem like, especially like for Aaron, it would be there are national labs who have either OT or other cyber-related directorates that would potentially overlap with Cybercom's mission in that space.
So it's not unique that, like, I mean, there's different parts of the federal government have different missions, and so tech transfer, you know, the whole U.S. government does CREATAs, right? Like Department of Energy, NASA, HHS, they all have laboratories. You know, very broad definition of it. So even within DoD, you know, we have medical institutions, right? So then they could be potentially having overlapping subject matter with HHS laboratories as well, right? So it's not a unique issue, right? But we are trying to partner with the interagency. We are kind of trying to deconflict some of these relationships. We're working right now with our different partners and trying to figure out, hey, maybe you want to work with this, and maybe we'll work with this company. And we're also trying to find ways to have different members of the interagency actually take part in our CREATAs as other participants, which in some cases is a possibility where they can kind of come under our authority and then take part in the R&D.
Hey, let me jump on that, because I love the pilot you guys came up with, but I'm going to stipulate it's completely not scalable for the challenge we face. You know, if we saw anything in Volt Typhoon and a lot of the reporting that's coming on, it's our adversaries are absolutely going to attack all of our military mobility, all of our power generation, so our ports, our rail, our aviation. We can't make individual CREATAs with each of these. There's some bases that we could uniquely defend, and I'd put Alaska pretty high on that list. But we actually have to, I would be careful micro-solving this problem, and I'd be stepping back and saying, how can we, at a macro level, ensure, and this goes back to the interagency, that the other agencies are doing their jobs, right? Coast Guard is properly working with the ports to ensure that the 19 strategic sea lift ports are secure, that TSA is somehow they own rail, by the way, I'm not sure how, you know, is working with the 6 rail companies that move all our troops and forces and equipment across the country to ports and to aviation, how TSA is working with aviation, how energy is working with the power industry to ensure that we're defended, because unlike every other warfare area, we don't own it. DoD, if it's a submarine threat, they got it. If it's an air threat, they got it. But when it's a cyber threat, we don't own the battle space, the infrastructure on which it's being fought. And we have to have those other federal agencies. We can't have, I love these pilot CREATAs, but they cannot scale to the degree to defend all these areas. And that's really going to take the department, really the White House, getting the other federal agencies to defend our national critical infrastructure with the same vim and vigor that the Department of Defense does it. And I'm going to tell you, 16 out of 17 of the other federal agencies aren't up for the fight right now.
I think the goal is not to scale, I think, to the way, maybe not to what you're saying. We're not trying to replace CISA. I think CISA has a huge role. I mean, that this is their space. For us, this is more about conducting R&D, you know, so that our forces can be better prepared to support CISA. And so if there was an event, you know, like a DISCA event. So I think the goal is not for us to replace them. There's certain places that we're prioritizing based on input from the geographic combatant commands that maybe are supporting key U.S. military installations, but we're in no way seeking to take on responsibility for all of that. And
saying is, the other part of this is that you have to force that. You have to force the rest of the federal government to have this level of commitment.
I think that's time.
All right, Eric, Aaron, Courtney, and Mark. Sir, thank you for that fascinating and thought-provoking panel. If you had a bet on the DFAR being described as beautiful more than once, you're the big winner. Your prize is out front. But I do think this panel demonstrates that sometimes partners agree and can reach a wonderful outcome. Sometimes partners and friends don't agree. But through engagements and discussions, we can all mature and get to that point that our client is trying to get to and is in the best interest of the American people. So thank you. Please give a round of applause to our panel. And we are back on at 14:35. You are on break.
Hello, my name is Major Alex Holtzclaw, and I'm joined here by Captain Ray Macias. We are legal advisors with the U.S. Cyber Command's Office of the Staff Judge Advocate. We want to share with you what makes working at this office unique, challenging, rewarding, and why you should consider joining the DoD cyberspace operations legal community.
The United States, along with many other countries around the world, maintains that international law applies to cyberspace. The DoD at large is committed to ensuring that cyber operations are conducted not only in accordance with international law, but with domestic law and policy as well. The law, however, remains very much unsettled in the cyber domain. The role of military cyber practitioners is to interpret and apply an evolving regime in real time, offering careful consideration of international law, domestic authorities and policy implications, and their impact on national and international security. It is not uncommon for cyberspace operations legal practitioners to advise commanders and decision makers on questions of sovereignty, constitutional principles, domestic criminal law, fiscal law, and even the law of armed conflict.
For example, the prohibition against the use or threat of force during peacetime is generally well understood in the physical domain. In the cyber domain, applying treaty and customary international law becomes more challenging where cyber malicious activities are conducted below the use of force, and where the identity of the threat actor may not be clear. Due to the low barrier to entry, state and non-state actors, including criminal organizations and violent extremist organizations, are acquiring sophisticated cyber capabilities at an alarming rate. Using this technology to target critical infrastructure, financial institutions, media platforms, and elections, cyber threat actors employ cyberspace to undermine democratic values while advancing their malicious goals. Events in the news demonstrate these issues are not mere hypotheticals or academic exercises. They are a present reality. Cyber legal practitioners enable the United States to maintain and extend our technological advantages in the cyber domain through development and acquisition of capabilities and talent needed to thwart malicious cyber actors today and stay ahead of future threats.
Legal advisors perform a vital role in assisting commanders with making informed, risk-based decisions to ensure that our response to malicious cyber activities complies with applicable law and policy. We also help decision makers develop meaningful relationships with other federal agencies, international allies and partners, and the private sector to ensure that all stakeholders are working together to defend against foreign and domestic cyber threats.
Experience in the operational environment, national security law, intellectual property, and contracts are all directly applicable to the DoD cyberspace operations legal practice. By encouraging respect for the rule of law and reinforcing norms of responsible state cyber behavior, as well as acquiring the necessary capabilities to maintain and extend our technological advantage, cyber law practitioners can ensure that the United States and its allies and partners are positioned to defend shared interests in the rapidly evolving strategic environment. We look forward to continuing this conversation through our practice and through the thoughtful dialogue here at the U.S. Cybercom Legal Conference. We encourage you to join us in the cutting-edge legal practice of cyberspace operations.